Well, joining me this week for a special debate are Peter Hitchens, author and former foreign correspondent. He's a columnist on the Mail on Sunday. Yvonne Ridley is a journalist who was captured by the Taliban in September 2001. She converted to Islam after release and has become a vocal supporter of Muslim causes. Peter Neumann is Professor of Security Studies at King's College London and is Director of the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation. And Usama Hassan fought with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against Soviet forces before changing his views on jihad. He's now part of the counter-terrorism think tank, the Quilliam Foundation. We want to know what you think. If you have a webcam, you can join us via Skype. You can also give your views on Twitter or by phone. Phone calls cost up to 5p a minute from most landlines, and calls from mobiles may cost considerably more. Texts will be charged at your standard message rate. Now, British Muslims have taken part in foreign conflicts around the world, including Afghanistan, Bosnia and Syria. Now it's claimed that some young Muslims have also been recruited from the UK by Al-Shabaab, which espouses jihad or holy war, and claims responsibility for the attack on the Westgate Mall in Kenya, in which at least 67 men, women and children died. One British woman Muslim convert with alleged links to terrorism has been put on Interpol's wanted list. But why are some young Muslims attracted by the idea of jihad? The attack in Kenya by Al-Shabaab, taking place as it did in a shopping mall, brought home once again the true horror of terrorism. British Muslim convert Samantha Luthwaite, dubbed the White Widow, who was married to one of the London 7/7 suicide bombers, has been linked with the planning of the attack. But so far there is no concrete evidence to support this. However, she is sought for questioning over another alleged terrorist-related offence, and Interpol has circulated her details, describing her as dangerous. It's been reported that there could be around 50 Britons involved with Al-Shabaab, and Americans too. Like other terrorist movements, the organisation uses the internet to glamorise its activities.
If you guys only knew how much fun we have over here, this is the real Disneyland. You need to come here and join us.
I'd like to take this opportunity to invite all the Muslims who are living in the lands of disbelief to the lands of jihad.
It was the dead of night when he finally departed.
There has been action to limit the spread of radical teaching by Muslim clerics in the UK. Abu Qatada has been deported to Jordan. And Omar Bakri Mohammed is banned from Britain. But the killing of drummer Lee Rigby on a London street, the foiling of other terrorist plots, and the continuing resonance of the 7/7 bombings has left a shadow over the Muslim community. And even though prominent leaders and imams in Britain continually speak out against extremism, some critics say that Muslims need to do more to tackle attempts to radicalise young people. So are Muslims doing enough to prevent radicalisation? Yvonne Ridley.
It's very difficult. You know, the Muslim community is being bashed in one direction for not doing enough. It feels under fire. You go into mosques where political discussion is banned. Young people are not encouraged to talk about Iraq, Afghanistan, political issues. And this is wrong. You know, we need more discussion in the mosques, in the Muslim community. Before I converted to Islam, I was a practicing Christian. The church I went to in St James's in Piccadilly had a political sermon every Sunday, and the mic was passed around, and we discussed things openly.
Plenty to discuss there. And it's the question for our text vote today. Are Muslims doing enough to prevent radicalisation of young people? Text the word VOTE followed by yes or no to 81771. Texts will be charged at your standard message rate. You can only vote once. Go online to vote for free, and results will be announced at the end of the show. And visit bbc.co.uk/Sunday Morning Live, where you can also read full terms and conditions. Peter Hitchens, there is a sense that there's a lot of the news media focus only on the negative, and that a lot of coverage of Muslims in Britain is negative. And could that in some way be part of the bigger picture in which young people feel alienated and potentially radicalised?
No, Muslims are covered in this way because news tends to be negative. News is when things go wrong. And that inevitably means that when you get covered by newspapers, it'll be when you do things which are wrong. But when people do things or say things which are generally considered by an awful lot of people to be outrageous, it's not surprising that the media cover it. And I think it's perfectly right for the media to cover it. Islam, if you're a believer, is the core belief of your lifetime. If you're not a believer, it's a philosophical and political position with which you can disagree. And a lot of people do disagree with it, and they're quite right to criticise it if they do so.
Okay. Osama, you did take up arms in the name of jihad. You fought the Soviets in Afghanistan when you were younger. Can you tell us briefly what made you do that?
I was fighting for God, and for the Muslim nation. I felt very strongly that any cause involving Muslims abroad was my cause, and there was also a desire for martyrdom, etc. It was also very exhilarating. It was really cool as a young man. I was only 19. To learn to fire guns and to fire them actually in anger on the front lines in these spectacular mountains was really exhilarating and really inspiring, and something which stayed with me for the rest of my life.
What made you change your mind? And what distinctions did you start to make about different kinds of jihad and where it was appropriate?
Well, our group sent dozens of fighters to Afghanistan and to the Bosnian War in the 90s, and we saw that as a legitimate jihad, where Muslims faced ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, for example. But one wing of the Mujahideen movement became Al-Qaeda and started justifying attacks on Western civilians and increasingly killing Muslims around the world as well. So after 9/11, I did a lot of soul-searching and realized there was a big difference between ethical, legitimate jihad, always has been for centuries in Islamic jurisprudence, and with the subversion of that, where it was being used for terrorism and indiscriminate attacks on civilians in non-theatres of war.
And just briefly, the idea that you said, I found the idea of martyrdom attractive. I mean, many people will be astounded at that, and they don't understand this appeal. Can you explain it?
No, I think for anybody who has an ethical position in life, it's perfectly logical, which is to live and die striving and struggling for noble causes. You know, better to stick to principles of truth and justice, stand up for what's right.
And just tell us briefly, where did you get recruited into this group that sent people off to jihad? Was this at college or where?
This was at Boston University and College, and in fact it's a core teaching of Islam to live a noble life and to offer your life to God. Martyrdom is a Greek word which is also in the Christian scriptures.
Well, we'll go into the details of kind of martyrdom and jihad in a bit, but Peter Neumann, I mean, it's interesting that it was at university, and in universities, prisons, these places are still the areas where people worry about radicalisation and why young people are still being targeted and are vulnerable to it.
Yes, and I call them places of vulnerability because often people go to university and they feel quite lost. They're quite susceptible to people approaching them, building networks around them, and giving them a sense that they have a place to belong. That's why universities, I think, are vulnerable places for radicalization, but also prison. What's interesting is that over the past few years, we've seen some of that shifting. So there aren't radical mosques anymore in the same way that there used to be before 2001. A lot of this happens online now, in addition to the actual places.
Peter Hitchens, it's interesting, and Yvonne was saying it as well, that actually there's been a shutting down of a lot of debate around politics in places like mosques. And I wonder if, in a way, that's counterproductive. If it makes people feel that they go off and discuss it in these private groups, and maybe that's how they get sucked into
this raises this whole issue of radicalisation and getting excited about it. I mean, a lot of young people will always be revolutionaries. I was myself, from the ages of 17 to 24, a revolutionary socialist who believed in the overthrow of the capitalist system by violence. And look at me now. It doesn't necessarily follow that you will do anything terrible, and if we judge people in our law-governed society not by what they think, or by what they say, unless it's actual incitement to violence, we judge them by what they do. I think there's an awful lot of rubbish talked, actually, about radicalisation and trying to prevent it and trying to reach into people's minds in this fashion. If people want to discuss these things, the more openly they do it, the better. And also, actually, from a straightforward security point of view, the more openly they do it, the better, because then you'll know who they are. And when they do start doing things, if they do start doing things, you'll be able to do something about it.
You see, you can't change the way people think, but I think back to the real national concern there was about cults in the 70s and 1980s, and this idea that you needed to deprogram in some cases because people were so young. There's been the targeting of people with learning difficulties by Islamists sometimes.
And you sympathise with the families which are affected by this. Of course you do, because it's a horrible thing for them. But the idea that you can in some way reach into somebody's mind using the authority of the state and try and change the way they think ought to be repellent, I think, to any free person. It's just not something you should think of doing. People change their minds, not because they're made to, but because actually of experience of life and of coming up against things and finding out that what they believed was wrong, and they will change their minds in that case. They can sometimes be made to change their minds by debate, but as I say, the thing we are concerned with in a free society is not what people think, but what they do.
Oh, yeah, I mean, Peter, do you want to take that one first? It's an interesting challenge, isn't it?
I think it's very important. If you do what Osama did or other people did, if you want to blow yourself up, you have to be 100% certain that that is the right thing to do. And that's why I think that you need to really provide counter voices, because not in order to convince people that your point of view is wrong, but maybe to insert that 10% element of doubt that will prevent you from blowing yourself up, because you need to be 100% sure. And that's why it's important to have these safe spaces for discussion, not to have people convince each other of each other's point of view, but because it inserts that element of doubt that prevents you from doing something.
Could I just, there's a very important point here, which I'd just like to try and get off my chest first and foremost, which is this. If we are arguing with the Muslim criticism of Western society, then we should stop arguing with it by nature of force, saying in response to what militant Muslims do, in response to what violent Muslims do, we will respond with violence and wars against terror. I always remember when George W. Bush was denouncing at some point some terrorist action, he said, they, the Muslims, they hate our way of life. And I said, well, actually, in many ways, I hate our way of life as well. There's an awful lot about modern Western society which is squalid and degenerate. It's seen from a straightforward Christian point of view. There is a critique there. There's a much better answer to it than armed force and secret police techniques and surveillance, which is to argue about what the solution to it is. The trouble is that our society, having abandoned the Christian faith largely, doesn't have much of an answer to it beyond saying we're better, you're worse.
Yvonne.
Well, I find myself in the unusual position of agreeing with a lot of what Peter is saying. But, you know, you're describing yourself as a 17-year-old, as a revolutionary. I'm just wondering if you would have come under the attention of the security services, if think tanks would have been out there creating fear about individuals like yourself. And, you know, when you see the way that discussions are being closed down in universities, which are places of learning where young people should be able to push out the envelope and explore, and yet they're being closed down.
There is a specific. We definitely did come under the eye of the security services, without any doubt at all.
Okay, Simon.
I was just going to say, discussion has been closed down in both directions. So I agree, mosques should be places where people can discuss politics and the things that matter to them. But in some cases, in mosques and university campuses, extremists have shut down the discourse. Anybody who criticises the prevailing extremist discourse. Well, anybody who's openly supporting Al-Qaeda, for example, and glorifying terrorism, which has happened in a very small number of mosques and university campuses, it has to be said. But there are people there who've shut down that debate, and anybody who's criticised that who've been forced out of the mosque or Islamic societies. And universities, for example, have to do more. It's not just Muslims who have to deal with this problem. This is an issue for the whole of British society.
You see, the Korean Foundation called me an extremist. I don't support Al-Qaeda. I mean, why would you call me an extremist? Why would you write to a TV station saying, don't use this woman, she's an extremist?
Well, I didn't take part in that. That was before my time, but I've been called an extremist by.
Okay.
I've been called an extremist by friends of yours, for
the whole
example,
issue of how Muslims are labelled generally. But I'd like to bring in another contributor, who's Yasmin Alabai-Brown. She joins us from our London studio. Yasmin's a journalist who's been writing for many years about her concerns over radicalisation. You've heard the debate so far. There's this particular interest in whether debate is being shut down in places like mosques and universities, and whether it should actually be opened up again. What's your view about why there's still such a problem with radicalisation among the young?
Well, I think I agree with Osama that it has to be a proper debate. Whenever I write anything that this kind of growing conservative, with a small c, brand of Islam that has grown across the West and everywhere else. If you raise anything that they don't like, they shut you down. Yeah, they shut you down.
In what sense do they shut you down?
They threaten you. I mean, I have very severe problems, for example, with the veil, and I wrote some very reasoned columns about it. Well, you should see the correspondence. They're not open to debate, and I've been thinking about this. I think it's wrong to say what should Muslims do about this. I think the question should be what should we all do about it. And I understand their anger, and I do agree with Peter completely on his analysis about these wars and so on. But there's a problem now, which we never had before, which is a slow kind of growth of the idea that you can never belong to these societies in which you live.
Isn't that a Muslim problem? If there is, as you say, a growing conservative strain which is becoming mainstream. I mean, I was thinking of sectarianism. There's a lot more attacks on, for example, Ahmadiyya Muslims, and this is all going on in modern Britain.
Yes, but it's this idea that there's only one way to be a Muslim. We can't talk about it, and also that you can't belong. Now, we get enough kind of flack anyway from other people saying you can't belong. But when we start saying we don't want to belong, and there is this kingdom somewhere that we're now going to belong to and fight for, that's quite twisted.
Yasmin, stay with us. I want to put that issue to Sheikh Dr. Mohammed Al-Husseini, who's an imam and a fellow in Islamic studies for the Westminster Institute. You know, the concept of jihad, we know, is really contested and difficult. But also what Yasmin raised, this idea of the ummah, the brotherhood, which can be a very positive one. There's a danger, isn't there, that it's also being a way of saying to Muslims, you're never going to be part of a country, you should never have a national allegiance. Somehow the brotherhood of Muslims out there is more important. Is that a theological problem?
Well, the notion of being a Muslim is standing in relation to God, and that's how our holy scriptures, as indeed the scriptures of other Abrahamic religions, have articulated it. I never bought a green membership card to be a member of this so-called Muslim community. I have, like every other British citizen, multiple belongings, multiple identities. You know me as a fiddle player and an academic and a member of a family and a member of a nation and a culture. I think what I'm concerned about is a growing political correctness that erodes the academic freedom within which we can talk about questions about such as jihad. There's not a single one of my Jewish rabbinical colleagues, for example, who isn't thoroughly embarrassed, or indeed Christian theological colleagues who are thoroughly embarrassed about certain passages in the Bible that promote violence or slavery or child marriage or stoning. And in a culture such as ours, which is one of intellectual freedom, we need to have the ability to discuss these questions in relation to Islam and to Muslims and to what the Quran has to say.
How
we no
have they
longer
done
live
it?
in a desert society of brutal desert vendettas and blood feuds, and our texts need to be revisited and revised in connection to the current realities in which we live, a plural society with multiple belongings. What I'm worried about is that we have an interfaith industry which is taxpayer funded. We talk about challenging extremism, but we give millions of pounds in taxpayers' money to organisations like the Interfaith Network for the United Kingdom, whose membership includes Islamist groups like the Islamic Foundation, the Muslim Council of Britain, far-right Hindu nationalist groups like the VHP, and there's a report coming out next month that outlines these things. I think we need to look at the contradictions in our strategy in relation to all these matters and promote intellectual freedom and free debate about core theological questions.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Husseini. Yasmin, what's your reaction to what Dr. Al-Husseini was saying there?
Oh, God, I wish I could go and speak to him. He speaks for so many of us. You know, one of the awful things is that what he's had the courage to say, even I sometimes find I don't have the courage to say. Let's look at all of these things afresh. But, you know, there is a shutdown. So when Muslims complain that debates are being shut down, they're right to complain. But they Muslims are also shutting down the kind of debates we need to have.
Thank you. Osama, you know, the Quilliam Foundation that you now work for, it very much works on, you know, counter-terrorism and on helping people who've had a background in radicalism. And I just wonder, in your experience, is there something about converts that makes them more vulnerable to extremist ideologies? You talked a lot about problems innate within Muslim debate, but conversion is a part of the issue, isn't it?
Well, not necessarily, but clearly some converts have got involved with terrorism very quickly. For example, the shoe bomber, going back some years, one of the 7/7 bombers, and his widow, who's now wanted for similar offences, the Woolwich suspects, bombings in Exeter and Bristol, or attempted bombings at least. One of the problems, again, the Muslim community has to deal with is making the mosques and Islamic organisations more welcome for converts. I've been working with the community for over 30 years, and many converts complain that mosques are unlike Pakistani or Bangladeshi or Arab clubs, if you like. And there's a strong cultural element there where Western converts to Islam don't really feel welcome. And if they're going to be then ostracised or marginalised, they may be more vulnerable to the extremist groups, especially if they don't know too much about Islam. Being new in the faith, they can be radicalised that way.
Peter Hitchens, what's your thoughts about the discussion that we've just heard with Yasmin and Dr. Al-Husseini?
Well, I think one could often encounter intelligent, liberal-minded Muslims living in the West who take this sort of attitude towards the faith. But the trouble is, how much do they speak for the religion as a whole? When I travelled to Deoband, where one of the great Muslim universities is in India, and I talked to some of the teachers there, and I said, this thought that the Quran could be changed, that you could go through a reformation like the Christian one, is that possible? And they said, absolutely not. It is the unmediated word of God. It isn't possible to change it. They can't, by their nature, accept this. And I think one has to turn to Muslims and say, this is what you believe, and you are in a way stuck with it. If you want to have a debate about about what religious precepts people should follow, then I would say the great debate that has to be had in this country, and ought to be had before it's too late, is whether we should accept Islam as being the predominant religion among us, which I think is quite possible in the next century of the way things are going, or whether we should rediscover our own Christian roots, argue for them, and say to our Muslim friends, brothers and sisters, that this is a Christian country, and that is the rule which we have decided on, basis of our civilization. You'll have to accept that too.
I just want to put that to Dr. Al-Husseini. If you heard what Peter Hitchens was saying, it's a sense that there's a fundamental, you know, non-negotiation about the status of Islamic belief, and that's the biggest problem we've got.
Well, I don't think that's at all true. We have a practice of engagement by scholars from the Jewish, Christian, Islamic traditions, looking deep into our texts, looking deep into the vastness and the contradictory nature of our traditions. We're not actually that different. Our texts contain materials that are profoundly uplifting. The Abrahamic traditions have promoted the worship of the one God, provided ethical codes for us, but they've also provided bases for behaviours that are deeply disturbing and have been deeply disturbing to people over the centuries. They've promoted violence and genocide, and these things can be looked at together in a shared scriptural conversation, and that's exactly the kind of work that we're doing.
All right.
What I'm concerned about is that in the art of the interfaith industry of saying nice things we don't really mean to people we don't really like, what we've ended up doing is promoting certain Muslim groups like the MCB, which in reality don't represent the British Muslim public. The Policy Exchange did a survey that showed only 6% of British Muslims surveyed felt that the MCB represented them in any way, shape or form.
Thank you.
Cutting out a silent majority of the Muslim community.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to bring in Peter Neumann here. Thank you, Dr. Husseini. There's so many interesting issues.
I think it's important also to point out that it's not just about the content of the Islamic faith. What draws people into radical extremist or terrorist groups is as much the sense of brotherhood that people get, the idea of embracing a cause, the idea of belonging to something. And you can almost mold any kind of ideology into that direction. So I would advise, it's important to have that discussion about the content of the Islamic faith, how it is twisted, how it can be misinterpreted. But it's also important to pay attention to other factors, because a 17-year-old is not an expert in Islamic ideology.
And I should just say that the Muslim Council of Britain, who Dr. Al-Husseini referred to there, we don't have someone from them on to defend what they think is their ideology. I just want to move on slightly, Peter, and I'll let you back in on this. But there is an issue about if there is a politically correct attempt to shut down open discussion. Is there also an issue whether Muslims portray themselves as victims? Whether in Syria where they want Western intervention, or in Iraq where the West shouldn't have intervened?
Well, people always portray themselves as victims if they want to get help, but I just do want to respond to something Dr. Al-Husseini said. I'm not saying that he's insincere in what he says about wanting to alter the precepts of Islam in some way, but we do face this problem, and it is really most strongly shown in the treatment of women by Islam, in their legal position as subjects to men, and the way in which they're increasingly pressured, as Yasmin correctly said, pressured to take the veil. This is a very, very fundamental disagreement, and it's not going away, and it's getting stronger. And also there is the other final thing, you cannot leave the Islamic faith. It's an absolute offence against the Islamic faith to leave it. And it has many entrances and no exits, and that is a very fundamental thing which does not change.
The issue that Yasmin was making to some extent is that, there is a growing conservatism in the public voice of Islam. And, for example, Muslims who leave the faith say that they have to keep it quiet or they get terrible treatment in some cases. That is a concern, isn't it?
The Quran makes it perfectly clear that there is no compulsion.
Sure, but in reality in Britain, do you accept there's a problem that Muslims feel there's a growing conservatism and you can't leave the faith without it potentially being really quite dangerous?
Well, they're being told that there is.
You don't think there's a problem, though?
No, I don't think that there is.
We should go to Deoban then and ask them. They'll tell you apostasy is an absolute unchangeable
Well, they're
crime.
ultra-conservative, Deoban, and they
they certainly are.
They don't represent the majority of Muslims.
But we can all pick out religious texts.
And there is a Reformation in progress. I'm sorry, Peter, you may not be aware of this, but arguably a Reformation has been going on for a century and a half. Now, the medieval law on apostasy, which was very strict, and as Yvonne says, goes against the Quran, which says no compulsion in religion, that was repealed by the Ottomans in the mid-19th century.
Well, we'll be hearing about the Ottomans later, but we're talking about Britain in the 21st century. Yvonne, what more did you want to say on the issue?
I would just like to pick up on several things that Dr. Mohammed Al-Husseini said. And, he was talking about interfaith and talking about excluding groups. He mentioned a couple of Muslim groups, he mentioned a Hindu group. When you start excluding groups, especially in interfaith, an all-encompassing concept, that's when you're heading down,
I suppose what's interesting is that we have all this interfaith dialogue at a time when we've got growing concerns about homegrown, British Muslim terrorists getting involved in incidents abroad.
I think there are two separate issues. The fact that religions have become more conservative over the past 30 years is not only true for Islam, it's also true for Jewish Orthodoxy, it's also true for Christian evangelicals. It's been a worldwide trend, and there are reasons for that. That is a problem for societies. There's a separate problem which is about terrorism. The two things are not always necessarily connected.
All right. I'd like to bring in well, I'd just like to move the discussion a bit onto solutions then, if we are looking for a way out. And we're joined by Mustafa Akyol, who's from, I'm trying to think, Islam. He's the author of Islam Without Extremes. You've been studying, how radicalisation is making people, in some cases, take up a jihad. Do you think there's a difference between people going to places like Syria, joining groups like Al-Shabaab? Is there a difference between them?
There is a difference. First, let me tell you, if you will, I don't live in the UK, I live in Turkey, and there is sometimes a difference between a Muslim minority in a larger non-Muslim society, and the communal tensions created by that might lead to more radicalization. Because I sometimes hear some radical voices in the UK which are unparalleled in Turkey. And I think that comes from those communal tensions rather than the doctrine of Islam itself. And one more thing, I agree that apostasy, the ban on apostasy, is a problem in mainstream Islamic tradition, but it's not Quranic, and it should be interpreted, as I argue in my book in a chapter on freedom from Islam. As for jihad, the concept jihad should not be demonized, as some Islamophobes in the West have been doing. We should actually criticize and condemn groups like Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda for violating the rules of jihad. Classical Islamic doctrine, even in medieval ages, the doctrine have made a big difference between combatants and non-combatants.
Okay.
And nowhere in Islamic history, non-combatants were considered as legitimate targets. What Al-Qaeda and its ilk does in the past few decades is that they, with some twisted interpretation, justify the killing of everybody, basically, who disagrees with them.
Okay.
So they are actually violating the rules of jihad as defined by Quran
All right,
and
Mustafa,
Islamic tradition.
thank you. Can I bring Yasmin Alibi-Brown back in here? Yasmin, I can't help feeling I've heard this argument about, well, it's, you know, Al-Qaeda aren't actually, you know, good Muslims, but it's not necessarily helping, is it, in terms of young people getting radicalised? What do you think the solution is?
Well, I think it's a very clever trick. Whenever Muslims do anything wrong, and let's face it, many Muslims do a lot of very bad things. They're not the only ones, but they do. And when I talk about them, people say, but they're not real Muslims. So, I'm sorry, once you've started saying they're not real Muslims, you've disengaged with the problem. It's a difficult problem. I come from a community which is ostracized everywhere by Sunni Muslims in particular, right? Because we're not considered part of the real Islam. And that started with the death of the Prophet, these schisms. But nowadays, there is this terrible problem, because what happens is these purists just deny all responsibility for the bad things that are done by Muslims.
Yasmin, thank you. I want the panel briefly to respond on solutions then to radicalisation. Osama first, working with the Quilliam Foundation, what works?
Muslims need to recapture the spirit of Islam, in the end, which is about faith in God and,
but even more
and love and mercy.
What do you do at Quilliam that's helping young people like yourself turn the back on
Well,
jihad?
we're challenging the narratives, which were very narrow and superficial, which pitted the whole world into a war between Muslims and everybody else, and misusing scripture to do that. One of the things we do is to point out the diversity of thought within Muslim tradition right from the beginning, and to encourage people to have that debate.
Okay.
By closing down
Yvonne.
debate in universities.
Well, Yvonne, what's your solution, briefly?
It is. You need to open up the universities to a real full debate and bring in so-called extremists. University students aren't idiots. If somebody is standing up spouting nonsense, they're not going to be sucked in. And I think we have to give our young people more credit by having an open debate and exploring all the avenues.
A number of Islamic Society presidents have become terrorists. One tried to blow up a plane in 2009.
A number, you're talking one example, and this is the trouble. You know, you go on about converts to Islam. There are more than 100,000 converts to Islam in Britain since 9/11. The majority are female in their 30s. We aren't going out to blow ourselves up, and yet that is the way, the perception that the Quilliam Foundation will give.
And I want to bring Peter Hitchens and Peter Neumann in as well. I just very briefly want to go back to Mustafa to say, how do you tell Al-Qaeda that they don't represent Muslims? There's no leader, you know, there's no caliph, is there? So how do you do this thing with theology that's supposed to change everything?
First of all, I should say that my argument is that they're not real Muslims and we are the real Muslims. They are Muslims, I mean, Al-Qaeda and the fanatics. But they are fanatic Muslims, and that's the problem. And they don't represent the majority of the Muslims, and their particular interpretation of Islam has been detached even from tradition when it comes to, for example, concepts like jihad. In particular, they also believe in a certain conspiratorial vision of the world in which every conflict in the Muslim world, so they believe, is a conspiracy by the West.
All right,
so
I'm afraid we have to leave it there, Mustafa, because we don't have much time. But thank you. Sorry, it was just a brief chance. Peter Hitchens.
Well, they'd say the same about him. That's the trouble. And there is no authority to which anybody can appeal in Islam. They can't. Neither of them can agree on which is right. One small point: the man who blew up the plane would not have been prevented from blowing up the plane by the shutting down of debate. As far as I can see, that's neither here nor there. Open and free debate is always the best way to deal with any idea in society. Can we stop referring to Islamophobia? There is no such thing. People are perfectly entitled to dislike and criticize Islam if they wish to. It is a political position which you can legitimately disagree with. It's not a pathology. Finally, if our society is to defend ourselves against this, then I would think that rediscovery of the beauty and force of the Christian religion might be a very good start.
Okay, and Peter Neumann, final word to you.
I think it's very important what Osama said about challenging the narrative, but it should happen not only in universities or in prisons, but also especially online, because I think online a lot of the extremist voices are totally uncounted. A lot of the traditional groups are not online. They are not doing the work where young people are, and that's where it has to happen.
Thank you. Thank you all so much indeed for that very considered discussion, to all our contributors on webcam as well. Our vote on this is open. I know people have been contributing a lot on it online. The question, are Muslims doing enough to prevent radicalisation of young people? Remember, you can only vote once. If you think they are, text the word vote followed by yes, and if you think they aren't, text vote followed by no. Our text number is 81771, and texts will be charged at your standard message rate. You have around 20 minutes before the vote closes.